Good afternoon. May I ask the panelists to kindly come up to the front of the room? Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Laye. I'm the Director of Evaluation at Unicef. I'm happy to welcome you to this third event of the high-level political forum. I'm also happy to welcome you warmly to Unicef House. Particularly pleased that we have a distinguished panel of colleagues and a moderator and a discussant. I know our moderator will introduce the panelists, but please allow me to welcome them to Unicef House. Dr. Grace Bediakun, whom I knew when I had lots of hair on my head. and trust me, that the hair was all black then. And I'm glad you could come, Akwaba. Honorable Then Pagnathum, welcome from Cambodia. Mr. Martin Acuna, welcome from Chile. Madame Josephine Watera, welcome from Uganda. And Estelle, where's Estelle? Estelle Ramondo from the World Bank, welcome. And Mr. Pungas Ali, welcome. And finally, our partner and friend, Dorothy Lux, welcome. Our event today is about powering up for success, inclusive and dynamic country-led evaluations, and it is jointly convened by ourselves, UNICEF, Eval SDGs, and UNITAR. The importance of the event lies in a few words: country-led, SDGs, dynamic, and evaluations. 4 years after the SDGs were adopted, it is time for the global community, all of us, our countries, our organizations, to jointly, again, review progress. Usually, reviewing progress means monitoring. It also means a focus on evaluation. So, country-led monitoring and country-led evaluation. The experience from the past 3 years is that there has been a lot of focus on monitoring, the M, but less so on evaluation, the E. Perhaps it's because many countries have invested a lot in monitoring systems. I'm happy to see my old friend Ray Rist here. He has assisted many countries to strengthen their monitoring systems. But I think less and less countries have invested in their evaluation systems. While we know that monitoring is very important, there are many things that we have to rely on evaluation to reveal to us, and perhaps that's why we are here today. We need to know what policies and programs are working well or not. We need to know the degree to which they are working or not. We need to know which elements can be scaled up, which elements should be scrapped, which elements should be sustained. We need to know, on the basis of credible evidence, what new policies and programs are needed to meet new challenges. Evaluation, the E, gives us an opportunity to know all these things and to know them at the right time so that we can continue to achieve our goals. The question has become, what types of evaluation bring the needed value in the spirit of the values of the Agenda 2030? And we all know the values: universality, no one left behind, multi-stakeholder partnerships, mutual accountability, interconnectedness, and so on. But what types of evaluation will help countries as they work harder towards their Agenda 2030? I'm sure our panelists will give us deep insights based on the work that they are all doing now. So please pay attention to what they say. Before I hand over to our moderator, I'd like to emphasize that we in UNICEF are committed to walking the talk. We would like to work with all of you, our sister agencies in the UN. I can see my colleague Indran here from UNDP, and those of you here, to support countries as we walk the talk about strengthening evaluations and in support of the SDGs. Last year, together with some partners, including some in this room, we assisted the African Union and UNECA to start a capacity program in this effort. And we will be building on this in other regions and continents in the current year. We cherish our partnership with Eval SDGs, and we know that we will continue to walk the talk together. We cherish our partnership with UNITA, the UN Institute for Training and Research. Brooks, our moderator, is from UNITA. So I'd like to hand over to Brooks. He's the director of the Division of Strategic Planning and Performance at UNITA. He's also their head in terms of evaluation and represents UNITA at the UN Evaluation Group. I hope our discussion today will be extensive, and I hope it will be deep, and I hope it will strengthen our partnerships as we continue to walk the talk, as we continue to strengthen the evidence base needed to go to work towards Agenda 2030. I thank you all.
Thank you, George. I'm distinguished to be the moderator, honored to be the moderator of this distinguished panel. As George indicated, it's going to be very lively, very, very topical today with respect to the state of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Before introducing the distinguished panelists in a bit more detail, let me just briefly introduce the three questions that will guide our discussions. The first question is, it is widely agreed that evaluation has the power to inform the voluntary national reviews and contribute to the implementation of the 2030 agenda. But 4 years into the implementation of the agenda and the SDGs, that power is rarely applied. How can we harness the power of evaluation for country-led evaluations? That's the first question. The second question, of course, in your experiences, what are the key success factors for SDG evaluations to be credible and inclusive? And the final third question is, based on your experience, what other success factors need to be taken into consideration for successful SDG implementation and SDG evaluation? As you can see, we would like to organize this panel in a talk show format. And most importantly, not only do we want to provide our perspectives to these three important questions, but we want to engage the audience as well. So we will also be turning to you. We've got 2 mics, I believe, and we'll have roaming mics as well. So we will encourage you also from time to time to speak up, ask questions, make comments on these 3 important questions. Let me turn to our distinguished panelists. To my immediate left, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Grace Bataiko, Director General of the Planning Commission of Ghana and Chair of the Statistical Board. And to her left, Ms. Josephine Waltera, who is Head of Monitoring and Evaluation Division of the Parliament of Uganda. Turning to my immediate right, Mr. Teng Pagnuktan, who is Director General of the Ministry of Planning in Cambodia. And to his right, Dr. Estelle Remedo, who is an evaluation expert at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. And to her right, Mr. Martin Garcia, who is the head of the Public-Private Cooperation Division within the Social Evaluation Undersecretariat of Chile. We're also pleased to have 2 distinguished discussants to the panelists, and we'll be asking to have their perspectives on the answers that our panelists will be given to these important questions. To my far left is Mr. Pungas Banchuri, who is the Director for Public Health and Nutrition at the Ministry of National Development Planning in Indonesia. And to my far right, Dr. Dorothy Lux, who's the Executive Director of SDG Global, a social enterprise with a focus on sustainable development and co-chair of EVAL SDGs. So with those introductions, let's begin, because we do have limited time this afternoon. Let's begin with that first question. How can we harness the power of evaluation for country-led evaluations? Let me begin with Dr. Batkaido.
Thank you. We thank UNICEF for inviting us here. I'm here representing my minister, the Minister for Planning, who could not be here because he's indisposed. Evaluation, I think the MC stated that evaluation is a real challenge, right? We often talk of monitoring and evaluation, but we generally are more committed to monitoring because it's part of our routine, and it's probably also easier because you collect the data and you track and you see where we're going. Evaluation has not been done systematically even in Ghana. So how do we harness the power? What we are doing, and we've recognized the gap. So one of the main things we have started working on is to have a policy, an M&E policy. In fact, it was supposed to be an evaluation policy, but we didn't want to leave also monitoring aside. So we're looking at a monitoring and evaluation policy that defines what needs to be done, how it's supposed to be, how evaluations are supposed to be funded, what institutions should be involved as primary institutions responsible and the secondary institutions responsible. The other thing we're looking at is to set up our system so that we have the regular participation of the citizens. We're always talking about the citizens' participation in the especially the evaluation part. And if we leave things to the various points of evaluation, we're not always getting to the people who may inform us, right, in a timely way. So we're actually developing an ICT-based monitoring and evaluation system. It is, apart from the automation and digitizing, the idea is to have real-time information from citizens. So let's say that there's a project and we're expecting to achieve something, there's levels of achievement defined. We would want citizens to send in information about where the project is, what impact it's having, whether it's working the way it is expected to work. So from across the time of the implementation, this information is supposed to be collected. And then we're hoping that in the end, where we set different times for the evaluation, we will feed the system or the exercise with the information that we're getting from the citizens, in addition to the designed approach to collecting information. So we are complementing the two. So that's it.
Thank you very much. And before I give the floor to the other panelists, what we'll try to do is we're going to take each question in turn. And after the end of each question, of course, we also want to turn to the audience and have maybe two or so individuals from the audience to provide their perspectives to these questions, because we really do want to engage the audience throughout the side event. So if we can keep maybe our responses to these two questions limited to maybe three or so minutes or so, and that will enable us to have enough time to have an engagement with the audience that'll be so important. Let me turn to my immediate right, Mr. Teng. How would you respond to this particular question in terms of powering up and really using the power of evaluation?
Thank you. Especially at the beginning, would like to thank to UNICEF for inviting me as the representative of the government of Cambodia to join this side event. I think for the first question, it's very, very good for us to work on how to strengthen our evaluation. For Cambodia perspective, I think in the past, we do not have like the clear role of evaluation to evaluate the policy and strategy of the country. Just recently, we start our process, especially under the process of reform we call public financial reform management. And then we try to link policy and strategy to the budget. So this is our step. And later on, we try to, because of we think evaluation is needed to see how the achievement of our policy and strategy. So that's why we try to lead, especially we call like ownership. So so far the evaluation in Cambodia not really driven by the government. So like many donors, they provide a support to any sector, and then they just set up one or small step of evaluation. So later on, under support, especially from Unicef, and then the government, we have set up the M&E guideline, and which we introduced to Line C, just to follow this M&E guideline, which we can follow and we can see the achievement, especially the need of data. And now we on the process to formulate our M&E strategy. So I think this is when we reach the point, especially we can evaluate the achievement of SDG as well. I think that is the step. In terms of the country lead evaluation, we just to mention a few. Recently, Cambodia government implement the approach with support by UNICEF to evaluate some project which are under the education sector. So I think when we seem like this is just the pilot. So when we see the result of the first pilot, and then we can expand to other sector as well. I think I just contribute some to the first question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Josephine, I'd like to turn to you and particularly have your perspective from the Parliament as your head of Monitoring and Evaluation Division within the Parliament. So that would be very interesting. Please, do you have a mic? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, our moderator. And I'm greatly honored to be on this panel this afternoon. And I'll share experiences that come from Uganda. How do we power up to see that we enhance evaluation in the design and development of VNRs? And I'll pick a few points. One of these is the legal framework. So in Uganda, we already have the national M&E policy for the public sector, and it clearly defines the institutional framework and responsibilities for different bodies, beginning from the executive side and up to parliament. And I'm glad that we have members of parliament with me here from Uganda who have joined this discussion, because there's a role that is being defined in there in terms of allocating resources, but also overseeing implementation of government programs. The other one is institutional framework in terms of where does M&E lie. So the office of the Prime Minister is properly catered for as the national office that coordinates the efforts of M&E in the country. And the office coordinates the National M&E Technical Working Group, which is the representation of officers managing M&E functions in different ministries, departments, and government agencies, but also ensuring that in terms of institutional framework, each sector, each ministry has an M&E unit, and that's why a number of colleagues have been interested in knowing that there's an M&E unit within the Parliament of Uganda. In terms of personnel, a lot of has been done to pick people from just being general personnel in terms of finance officers or economists, but having specialized training in M&E. So a number of staff have undergone this training. Finances, the national M&E policy defines that we need to have 3% of the budget for projects assigned, set aside for evaluations. And I'm glad that this is being implemented to facilitate us have assessment and evaluations of projects. To go the databases, so we have the government evaluation facility where information that has been collected in terms of evaluation is deposited for further use, but also for accessibility by different stakeholders, so that once information is on the system, you can always track back and know what worked and what did not work. But also I cannot underscore the role of other players, especially civil society organizations that have been on the other side of giving independent, credible information. And they work with Parliament, for example, through committees of Parliament, and our department is core in playing the role of a broker to bring them in terms of sharing their experiences and voices with committees of Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to an international organization, the World Bank, and ask Estelle if you perhaps could provide your perspective on this particular question. And if I may, try to go. We've heard a lot about policies and systems in place and evaluation units, but I'm wondering what else needs to be done to really harness the power of evaluations in the SDGs. Estelle.
Sure, thank you. So, because I think like an evaluator to your question, which is, why don't we see evaluation being paired up 4 years after? I was reflecting on what might be some of the reasons why it might be the case. And so, I think I speak from two perspectives. One is having conducted evaluations where we are looking at, the state of data, the state of citizen engagement in policy framing, and the other vantage point that I have is to be conducting evaluations and have some expertise in methodology as well. So basically, what I see is that there are three maybe challenges that need to be overcome. The first is definitely the need to have a really good and well-established evaluation system within countries, and our colleagues have spoken very well about what they are doing to establish a policy capacity and also some mechanisms for using evaluation. And here, to me, really the crux of the issue is the use part. I think we have for a long time now, with the result-based management tradition, established systems, produced data, produced evidence, etc. But the use part is still the weak link. So when we think about evaluation for the SDG, I think putting use at the core of how we build this system is important. And so making sure that, whether it's within parliaments or within the executive or whether within civil society, there are ways to actually use this knowledge and do better and do something different. So that's very important. The second part, I think, might be around the unique value proposition of evaluation. As you were mentioning before, we're in a world where in some places and for particular issues we have a lot of data. For others we have few data. And we have possibilities to track, etc., etc. But what is evaluation adding? And here I think we also have to think in terms of the methodologies that we've been using. And so with certain evaluation give us a very small perspective on one thing that's happening, and above all, most of our evaluations, I'm talking from the donor side a little bit, are very donor-centric. And so we often look from, the left to the right of the causal chain. So what are we contributing? So when we talk, in the theories of change or logic framework, you're all familiar with this, left to right, and then at one point we stop because we can't really know what's going on after that. So we feel a little bit stuck. But together, I think we can really explore the right to left. How are SDG moving? We have so many targets, so many indicators, and what are the contributory factors, and how can we all collectively influence these? So there is a coordination part that needs to happen with governments, with the different partners. I think that's essential, and that's something we haven't really reflected on. And the last part, I think, is also a little bit on the footprint of donors over time, also on having our own evaluation studies, our own and maybe sometimes there are opportunities to really adopt the spirit of the SDGs, which is to have sustained system. So we need to rely much more on building capacity where it's needed, and then relying really on this country-led. What are the questions that the country want us to answer? And I think we are moving in that direction. Sometimes a little bit scattered, and sometimes we are still looking very much inward. But I see a movement really where we have understood the spirit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Martin Garcia, let me just remind the audience, of course, if you have any burning questions or comments you would like to make with respect to this question, please jot them down, and after Martin provides his perspective, we'll be turning to the audience to engage you. Martin.
Thank you. I had an idea of what to talk about, but after hearing you all, I'm changing that a little bit. Well, I think the first point is that I want to convey is the complexity of the 2030 agenda. 17 goals, right? 169 targets, and 240 indicators, something like that. And it is a challenge to every country how to address that complexity and try to convey plans and procedures according to the 2030 agenda, and how to synthesize that with their own government plans or development plans. So that is the first point. The 2030 agenda is very complex by definition. So regarding the question, after this first point, it is the question of what to evaluate, right? We need to decide what to evaluate in terms of the different levels of what evaluations that you can carry it out. For example, you have your national development plan, you have your government plan. So how that government plan or development plan is coherent with the 2030 agenda? That is the first question. The second question, the second level, will be how that plan is going to be related to systems, budgeting systems, ministries, ministry plans, etc., etc. And in the third level, you can find, for example, programs and projects that each ministry is implementing. So you have three levels. So following this idea, are we going to have evaluation systems that are going to be addressing all these three levels? Or are we only going to be focused on plans and programs? Or are we going to be focused on budgeting too? So I think that raised a methodological question that is very important to address. And it is related to the idea of the complexity of the agenda. The agenda takes all the planning, all the budgeting, and all the plans and programs that are being implemented in a country, and refers to how to evaluate that particular implementation. And that is a big challenge. And taking into account the first evaluation that a country has made regarding the 2030 agenda, there is a paragraph that I want to reference from the Finland evaluation, the first evaluation that we have. Not one single country has just presented a plausible plan for how to achieve the 2030 agenda goals. Finland can lead the way, as it is the number one by many metrics and has every chance of accomplishing the SDGs. So if not one single country has just presented a plan, how are we going to evaluate that plan if we don't have that? So in Chile, for example, we have a lot of experience in terms of evaluating plans and programs. We have ex-ante evaluation and ex-post evaluation in different ministries. But we don't have a plan yet. So we are trying to convey a strategy of how to implement the 2030 agenda. And within that strategy, we should define in a multi-stakeholder view how to evaluate and monitor the agenda. So that should be included in that strategy. So we think that that is a very important point to note, and maybe we are very keen to hear about other countries' experiences in order to learn.
Thank you, Martin. And with that, let's open it to the audience on this particular first question. How do we power up for successful evaluations, SDG evaluations? Yes, sir, on my far left here. Can we get a mic, a mobile mic?
Well, thank you for having me here.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Ray Rist, and I'm retired from the World Bank in Washington, D.C. You have used the word power a number of times, but I am curious about whether the political science definition of power being either hard or soft. This has not come up, other than Josephine just a bit, talked about a bit of it inside the parliament. But I'm curious about the distinction between hard and soft power as it's conventionally used in some of the disciplines and the manner in which it's been omitted in any conversations here. And the question is whether that distinction between hard and soft power has any relevance or appropriateness to the conversation here. I actually think it does. but I would be curious about any of the members of the panel who would like to pick up on this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very, very interesting question. I'm sure our panelists will have something to say on it. Let me take maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am, please. Can you introduce yourself as well, please?
Thank you. My name is Diana Sarah. I'm a Ugandan and working here at Unicef. So it's really great to hear from the team from Uganda the steps the government has made to institutionalize evaluations at the national level. So I'm just curious to know if there's any progress that's been done at the subnational level in institutionalizing evaluations, especially given that the fact that a lot of service delivery happens at that level. So I'll be glad to hear from the team what their views are. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking at the clock, I think we've got a little bit of time to play with. So let me take two more questions. Yes, the gentleman there on my right in the back.
Yeah, very quickly, my name is Chris Tu. I'm from WFP, World Food Program. I'd be interested in hearing either from Uganda, Ghana, even Cambodia, what proportion or percentage of the SDG indicators are being collected by your countries? In other words, if you have 240 plus indicators, what percentage of those indicators are being collected, and what is being done to address the data gaps? Because without data, you cannot monitor or evaluate. So fundamentally, I'd like to find out where you think you are in terms of collecting the relevant data.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, the gentleman there. You can have the last question, then I'll turn back to the panelists. Yes, sir. We have a mic.
Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a research student from the University of Adelaide in Australia. I'm doing my thesis on monitoring and evaluation of SDG 4, so this is really relevant, of course. First of all, the point on Finland that was raised a second ago about not having a single plan, this is something that's frustrating me so far in the research. It seems that the UN has set the SDGs, but there's not a universal set of M&E or a framework that's being put in place. So it's up to each country to create their own framework to feed back into universal goals, but then that relies on each country having their own interpretation of what quality means. Are they looking at only quantifiable measures like attendance, testing, or are they looking at lifelong measures of quality of life, social status? So I'd be really interested to know whether or not there is actually a UN framework out there, a normative framework, and if there isn't, why isn't there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Four very interesting questions. Let's tackle the first question on power. Maybe Estelle, maybe you could kick that off. I know you're probably very interested in responding to that, but I'll invite the other panelists if they want to add to that as well. Estelle.
Thank you, Ray, for raising that. I wrote an article called The Power and Dysfunctions of Evaluation Systems in International Organization. So I thought a little bit about the concept of power, not around soft and hard power, but I think evaluation has much more power than we actually think we do, because we in organizations and with the agenda have really defined what success looks like. So we have also turned on their heads how we think about development. What's the worth of a program? All of that is defined with our own concepts, with our own vocabularies, logic framework. All of this logic, I think, has been really embedded now in how we think about development. So I think there is a huge power in evaluation systems. The power that we may not have yet is really in terms of informing and influencing the decisions where we actually should really be there. So in terms of that concept, I think we need to be cautious with the word power, but I like the power of the energy of evaluation, that's for sure.
Do any of our other panelists would like to follow up on that question of hard versus soft power? If not, maybe we turn to the, if not, yes? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. And Ray brought a good question and reminded me the last American Evaluation Association when we were talking about speaking truth to power. And definitely, like my fellow panelists has observed, evaluation has power. The way we say information is power. So you either have it or you don't. The more your evaluation tends towards what works and what does not work, the more we get to know where should we allocate more resources, the more we get to know who is benefiting, who is not benefiting, who are the winners and losers in society. So evaluation actually has power. And the way we have said there that it's two-sided. When the evaluation is on the table, is it getting to where decisions are supposed to be made? So it's about elevating it from just having the document on the table to actually using this document to influence and make change in society. And that's the power in evaluation we're referring to today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's turn to the second question, progress on subnational levels. I believe that was the question. Do we have any of our panelists interested in addressing that particular question? Any progress that is made, not at the national level in terms of M&E frameworks, if I understand your question correctly, but at the subnational level? That's the question. So do we have any of our panelists that would like to address that particular question?
Yeah, I guess it's not such progress, but still we're working towards it. You know, in Ghana, our planning system is decentralized. So whatever we do at the national level has to translate to the district level, where implementation of all our plans actually take place, as well as at the sector level. So we have had an M&E manual that we use, and we train our district staff in the use of M&E, monitoring and evaluation. But the constraint is still one, capacity, and then funding, because not enough resources are being allocated to evaluation. And I think it's been mentioned here, part of it is that I think the value of evaluation is not fully appreciated, because it can be expensive, it can be involving, so why do we go to all this length if we can get statistics to show that we are making improvements? So I think, yes, we are making progress in terms of getting the district level to understand the approaches and the use of data and how important M&E is. But there are still gaps, because we have to use the data to demonstrate, or use the M&E results to demonstrate that there's value in going through this whole trouble, because it is a demanding exercise. And so this is how we are.
Thank you for that. The two remaining questions, if you agree, I'm going to put them in the parking lot for a moment, and we'll come back to them. But looking at the timing, I want to move on to our second question, but they have been noted, and we'll put them in the parking lot. Turning to the second question that we have for you, in your experience, what are the key success factors for SDG evaluations to be credible and inclusive? And this is very much linked to the theme of the HLPF this particular year in terms of engaging citizens, engaging people, and inclusivity, and what have you. So let me repeat that question again for our panelists. What are the key success factors for SDG evaluations to be credible and inclusive? And maybe I'll go backwards this time and begin with Martin, if I may. Martin, do you have a mic?
Hello. Yes, I'm going to be concise. Key success factors. We think that first, the evaluations need to be transparent, clear regarding the questions and the methodologies, and also in which level are you going to perform the evaluations, and also at the highest level of authority possible. For example, you can carry it out an evaluation of a city, right? New York City last year developed their voluntary local review. And this year also Helsinki, right? So all the authorities need to be engaged in that process. And also regarding the unit of analysis, right? If your unit of analysis is going to be the country or a particular plan or program or a particular SDG. So this is related to my original comment regarding the complexity of the 2030 agenda. And also the SDGs, the reporting structure and also the evaluation that you are carrying out cannot be separated from the existing structures that you have in your country. Because what you don't want to do is to have separate structures with different reporting objectives. So the overall way to go is to have the systems combined in the efforts that the country is carrying out.
Thank you, thank you. Josephine, let me turn to you on this particular question again with your perspective from the Parliament in terms of what really are the success factors for SDG evaluations to be credible and inclusive.
Okay, thank you very much. And inclusiveness is about valuing voices of different people. And what we have done in our context, which relates to the question that was asking about subnationals, we have in Uganda what we call barazas. These are community advocacy groups where we pick out a specific area, and the Office of the Prime Minister organizes a sitting like this, where we bring stakeholders in terms of service providers, the politicians, and the beneficiaries in a community to share what has worked and what has not. And we think that this Baraza initiative has helped us to bring the voices of the people at the lower level and also influence from what comes from what they have given in terms of feedback, the planning of the next cycle. So in such a way, then we can see that whatever programs that we're going to bring in the next phase, it is something that has come from the people. They can identify with it. There will be ownership. There will be easy in terms of implementation, and we see sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Teng, your perspective on this particular question with respect to credibility and inclusiveness.
For Cambodia side, we're talking about the key success for the SDG. It's really hard for us at this stage because we just recently we complete the process of localize SDG into CSDG. And then for this year, we just start to prepare our VNR, which is going to present in coming of 16. So even we just start, but it's not mean that we are not the government not do anything related to how to the credible and inclusive. Inclusive mean for Cambodia, we think about most is we focus about cross-cutting, like gender, like vulnerable people and disability. And then recently we just start to prepare the guideline which relate to gender. And then we thinking about the implementation. And the result of implementation, we will start to cover to the other area as I just mentioned at the beginning. So this is for inclusive. Like for incredible, we will, because of through our assessment, and especially we work very close with Unicef, we think it's good that we apply OECD, that we focus about efficiency, effectiveness and impact and sustainability to integrate into our evaluation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Estelle, I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to put a little twist on the question, if I may, to make it a little bit interesting and maybe a little bit more challenging. But with respect to credibility, we speak about the importance, the principles, the standards that all evaluations uphold, principles of credibility. And evaluations need that methodological rigor to uphold credibility. But our real-time evaluations, there's more and more demand for real-time evaluations. We don't need them in 6 months or 8 months or 12 months from now. We need them now. We need them in real time. And the question I would like you to also address with this question, or the aspect, is that are real-time evaluations consistent with this need for credibility? So Estelle, you can have this challenging question to answer.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Maybe I might go around a little bit if you allow me. No, I will try to address it. So I think, so again, combining these three things, so inclusive, credible, real time, sometimes, you know, they go across purpose in at least the traditional way of thinking. So for me, I try to take it backwards. Again, the use part of the evaluation for me is absolutely critical. We can have the most, elaborate, long research, leveraging all kinds of data and methodology, but if ultimately it leads to nothing, then it belongs in the realm of research that can then be synthesized, etc. So to me, the use is important, and the inclusiveness is really part of the use. We've conducted a couple of studies on the power of data for development and also on mechanisms for citizen engagement. And what we found is that really you need a mechanism to broker that information. You know, so much data is collected at the local level and never stays at the local level. You know, it gets aggregated, etc. But parents, I'm sure, want to know if their kids are learning within that school where you collected the data and where you collected the evaluation. So there is a lot of power in the local use, and even not with really complicated M&E system, but just keeping the data where it is, where it was collected, and brokering it, you know, explaining what does that mean, etc. I think that's an evaluative task as well. In terms of the real time, that's a mechanism that's possible, of really, you know, having real feedback right away when we collect the data. Then there is the aggregation, there is the synthesis, there is also the time that needs to take place for the outcome to be visible. So sometimes you need long-term research. I think it's about the question that we want to answer and the use of that particular evaluation. There is space for both real-time and long-term. And on the credibility, we can debate methodology at one point if it's useful.
Thank you. And Grace, let's hear your perspective on this as well, if I may, in terms of the aspect of credibility and inclusiveness and what have you, in real time as well, if you want, particularly from your perspective coming from statistics as well.
Yeah, I'll give an example of one evaluation we did, which was on a capitation grant. The government giving money to schools so that they wouldn't charge extra for certain facilities. And from there, we learned that, you know, to be inclusive, you need to define the stakeholders precisely and target all those who are in some way connected to the issue. So, for example, for the capitation grant, you would look at the institutional level, the heads that manage the institutions, the teachers who are involved, the accountants, and all those functionaries. And then at the household level, we're looking at the parents to see if anything has changed as a result of the grant. And then focus group discussions. I mean, that allows the reality check. You know, sometimes my perception of what is wrong and what is right may not necessarily be the right one, may be distorted. So in focus group discussions, they talk about it, see if they're all in the same boat and whether there are some misunderstandings. Then there's also the validation, with the policymakers as well as the citizenry to feedback the information and get more inputs as to whether what the findings are realistic and accurate. So this process also helps the credibility because everyone feels they have made some input. The government does not feel that it is on the tests or is being judged, but they are also able to feed back into the results and take decisions about the findings. So in this particular case, we had to engage the Ministry of Education, and it became clear that their objectives were not being fully met, and they had to change some of their processes so that it would improve the results. For the real time, that is where we are going now, and I'm happy for the question because we also have to start thinking of, well, how does that help us be credible, maintain credibility? And I think it's a question of collecting also information that are not subjective. So if someone says my road is bad, well, now with the mobile devices, you can actually capture the state you are talking about so that we can compare and see if this is truly a serious issue or it's just an individual's perception of how bad it is. So I think there are opportunities for using real-time information because in some cases, we wait too long and things have changed. Where we could have made impact, we did not intervene, and so we correct after the fact. But if we can use real-time information and build in checks so that whatever one is saying is not just about subjective reflections, but also add some objectivity, I think we can get both, the best of both worlds, I imagine.
Thank you. Before opening it up to the audience, I just want to tackle the last question, but we're going to do it very quickly. I'm going to ask each of the panelists really just to identify one or perhaps two other success factors for successful SDG evaluations that have not been raised already. We've talked about systems, policies, capacity, budgets, and so forth. And a lot of this we've heard, and we're hearing it again, and it just, I think, underscores the importance of these factors to take into consideration. But now I want to open it up and go, if we can, probe a bit further and identify, is there anything missing? What's the missing pieces of the puzzle for successful SDG evaluations to make sure that evaluations do inform the implementation of the agenda and the VNRs and what have you. So let me turn back to Martin on that and just ask to be very brief because we want to turn it to the discussants. So we've got a maximum of maybe 10 minutes for this last question. Martin.
Yes, another key success factors could be the agreement, because the 2030 agenda is not owned by a government, right? It's not owned by civil society. It's not owned by the private sector. It is a society-wide agenda. So the agreement of what to evaluate and how to evaluate the processes that we are going to take into account, that agreement should be done in a multi-stakeholder view. And that is a big challenge, right? So as we discussed before, we don't have plans of implementations in a lot of countries, right? We have very few. We don't have national plans, national evaluation plans associated to those implementation plans. And regarding that, on top of that, we need to agree on what to evaluate and how to evaluate that. So we need to have the overall view of the challenges in order to convey the complexity of the agenda in a country. So that is a very important point to discuss, because we can start, for example, to have an evaluation of the SDG 4, right? But how that SDG is going to be related to the other ones? What actions are the civil society taking in that particular country regarding that SDG? What the government is doing? So when you start asking questions, you can see the missing parts of the overall structure. And the idea is not to have the overall structure in place in order to make evaluations, right? But it is good to have the overall view of what is missing in order to have the right question addressed in your evaluation.
Thank you. Estelle, we'll just go along the line here from my right to left.
I couldn't agree more with what you said, so I don't have much to add, but maybe to synthesize, I think I would say embeddedness. I would really not want to see just yet another parallel system that we call SDG evaluation, and with a separate unit or a separate set of processes only for measuring that target, etc. I think it's in the spirit of the SDG. It needs to be sustained, embedded, and owned by all the stakeholders within the country.
Thank you, Mr. Teng.
I think that is the good point we have to raise about the experience for the SDG evaluation. At this time, I just try to raise two or three key experience for Cambodia. The first, we talking about the strengthening, the result-based planning and link to budgeting. And then we can see the adequate of or we can like say inform evidence and data. And second, we talking about the budget. We so far the government, we have to increase the budget for conduct any census and survey in order to get data for SDG evaluation. And the third point is about because before we start our localized SDG into CSDG, we have support from UNDP and UNSD, and then we can see around 80% of policy and strategy in place. And for data, we just we available just around 50% that we have available data can monitor our CSDG. So because of the result in place, and then the government, we have we set up the we call the National Strategy for Development of Statistics. We try to find the gap, especially we can get more data in order can implement can monitor our SDG. This is the key three point that as our experience. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me turn to my left, Grace. If you can perhaps provide one or two key success factors that are the missing pieces of the puzzle. Very briefly, please.
Yeah, I think I can continue from where Estelle left off, which is, we made a commitment with the SDGs to integrate it into our frameworks. So it's important that our national planning and M&E system should really bring out the M&E component, and we have to plan and schedule evaluations along the planning cycle, so that when we have integrated SDGs, when we evaluate the plan, we are actually also evaluating achievement of the SDGs and what has worked and what doesn't. So it's critical that evaluation in itself becomes part of the program that we are implementing in our plans and our monitoring and evaluation system.
Thank you. Before turning to Josephine, just to remind the audience, I'll be turning to you, not for questions this time, but what, in your opinion, have you found that we've missed, that the panelists may have missed in terms of these factors for successful SDG evaluations? So we'll turn to you. First, we'll hear from Josephine very, very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the political will and commitment. And an example from Uganda, we have a minister designate for SDGs. And our parliament has a chapter for Africa Parliamentary Network on Development Evaluation, APNOD. And of course, we have also efforts like the Global Parliamentarians Forum that is focusing on where power is and the people who can actually use this evaluation to influence change. The other one is integration. She has touched on this a bit about what is happening in Ghana. And in terms of mainstreaming, we've done up to 70% mainstreaming in our National Development Plan. And annually, we issue what we call certificate of compliance to sectors, to what extent they have complied their sectoral plans to the National Development Plan. And another important one I can't go without mentioning is the gender and equity certificates. So this is about who has been left behind. Every year we produce the State of Equal Opportunities report, and the Equal Opportunities Commission will pull out which groups have been ignored, which services have left out some people, and so we think this is a good journey towards realization of SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to the audience very quickly. The gentleman there in the back there. And again, no questions, but very brief comments or just factors that really are missing, the missing pieces of the puzzle for successful SDG evaluations.
Okay, thank you. My name is Osai Akoto Bimpe. I'm from Ghana. And since we have a Ghana representative there, I wouldn't direct this question to her, but not question, comment.
No question.
I think that progressing, from the point of view of partnership, what I am missing, or what is missing currently, is how we would use partnership to complement each other in terms of evaluation. And I say so in the context of budgetary constraints that governments in developing countries find themselves in. And so you would notice that M and E, we pay a lot of attention to the M and leave the E out, especially when interventions are funded from domestic resources. How can we, I think that going forward, since you say we shouldn't ask questions, going forward, I think that civil society may have developed participatory evaluation, participatory monitoring and evaluation methodologies. And I think that we need to find a way to complement each other so that where government may not have the resources, civil society can provide some insight or some information that can help in understanding progress and providing insight into how we can change our strategy, know what is happening, especially from the perspective of citizens. When evaluations and monitoring are done from the perspective of citizens, that can really help to fill their vacuum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Up here in the front, Mike.
I'm Anu Saksi. I'm head of evaluation of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. And really, I appreciate very much what I have heard this from the panel, but you have to emphasize not enough the policy and the framework, but the resources. Like Martin said, it's extremely complex agenda to evaluate SDGs and the Agenda 2030. So resource them properly, plan, schedule, and enough budget and experts to evaluate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I've got the gentleman here, and then the lady there as well, and then, yes. Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is Omar
Please keep it brief. Yep.
From Ghana. Yeah, one of the things that we're doing in Ghana is, you see that the budgeting process has been redesigned to reflect the policy objectives and align to the cost of accounts, to the extent that you can tease out how much resources have been allocated to which particular SDG target. and to which specific institutions. So one of the things we're currently doing is to work with Parliament to support their oversight and representative role. And we just had a meeting with both the majority and the minority leaders of Parliament. And one of the things we'll be doing is to ensure that with time, we're able to provide to parliamentarians the specific allocations to the specific targets, to which specific institutions that within their constituencies, so that it can support them in terms of their representation in holding public institutions accountable. And that way we think it would go further to support the evaluation process, where the parliamentarians would have feedback from their constituents and take that forward to hold public institutions accountable.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Salima Namsobia from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights in Uganda. For me, I think transparency and accountability by all stakeholders, and here I would emphasize, for example, the private sector especially, and development partners, for example, in enabling access to information that would be used in the evaluation processes.
Thank you. And I believe on my right, another question, or not a question, but another remark, observation.
Hi, my name is Rosario. I'm from Peru. And I just wanted to ask how we make the link between quantitative data with qualitative results. How do we get the stories of people? How do we go from the hard data that we see in reports, that we see here at the high-level political forum, to the stories, to the lives of the people? And the other one is, how do we engage people in the collection of data, mostly youths? We had a great experience on the process to elaborate the 2030 agenda with the My World survey, where 9 million of people participated, and the data was gathered by people, mostly youth. 60% of the facilitators were youth. So how do we take this opportunity to somehow balance, in some cases, the lack of budget in order to gather this information?
Okay, so I'll just summarize those 2 points there in terms of not questions, but in terms of elements, in terms of the potential power of storytelling, in terms of the SDG evaluations, and also the engaging civil society, people at large, crowdsourcing, or what have you, and data collection and what have you. So interesting points. Yes, ma'am, and then I believe on here on my left as well. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Prudence Kauma. I'm coming from Zambia. From the Monitoring and Evaluation Division under the Department of Planning. For Zambia, what's lacking actually are proper results frameworks that integrate the aspects of SDGs for countries to effectively actually evaluate the SDGs, and also proper baselines that would be a good basis for evaluation. Like for Zambia, we are doing an MTR for our plan, which has mainstreamed the SDGs. But we have put in the TORs for the consultants, evaluate the extent to which we are also making progress towards the SDGs. But we're not very sure we have a proper results framework or theory of change that will ensure that all these issues that the SDGs, the principles of the SDGs, are actually captured in the midterm review. That's what we are facing in Zambia.
Thank you. 2 more comments and questions before I introduce the discussants. Do we have one on my left? Did I know? I've scared everyone away now. No, one in the back. Yes, please.
Thanks so much. My name is Bessina Timpepo. I'm with World Vision International. I just want to underscore the point that was raised around the importance of citizen-generated data for evaluations. And I think that one probably missed opportunity is how do we bring around the organizations that are already working with approaches that work to be able to have a scale that is acceptable for statistical officers. Because I think like an organization like World Vision, we're doing this in thousands of communities and we have the data. But it might not be compelling enough or statistically significant. So what do we do? How can we work together and bring this into technical databases that work?
Thank you. And last comment, last word from anyone from the audience. If not, we'll turn to our 2 discussants. And I'll ask our discussants not just to summarize what the panelists have said, but also what the audience has said as well in terms of points they've raised or questions they've asked or what have you. I think that's very important. So let me begin with Mr. Pangas Banchuri. If you have maybe 5 minutes or so maximum to summarize things and thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Brooke. Good evening, everyone. For the first questions, I think I wrote several key factors that I think is important. First, how we institutionalize the monitoring and evaluations by building legal frameworks or set as part of the policy. I think that's quite important. And one of the things that we need to consider, I think some panelists already agree that M&E is quite important, but the problem with the E is something that usually takes longer. And so the question is, how can we use the monitorings in the absence of evaluations? And evaluation can be complex, especially I'm from the social sectors, and very usually it's unethical to set up like experimental design. So this monitoring is very important. I think as long as we stick and our monitoring was based on the solid logical frameworks that is proven everywhere, that's good enough for us to monitor the progress. And how can we use the country-led evaluation? I think the first thing that we have to do is on the what we do here in Indonesia is we adopt the SDG target, but more importantly, how we adapt the target. For example, for mortality rate, it's impossible to measure it at sub-districts or even provincial level in Indonesia. We only measure it at national level. So we have to adapt these indicators that is measurable at local level, which is definitely is not the MMR, but the proxy that can use to MMR. So not all the SDGs can be applied directly into national context, even at the local context. And on the second questions relating to the key success factors, I wrote that 3 keywords. First is the use, as mentioned by the World Bank. I think we have to define what is the M&E and evaluations used for, and that will definitely defines how we conduct the monitoring and evaluations. Because this is important. For example, whether we want to use the methodology rigors for the evaluations, or we can use more simplistic ways in order to fit the process. Whether we're going to use for the impact evaluations, and that takes longer, or we can to inform the programs. So those two objectives will set 2 different monitoring and evaluation system. And we are in planning systems are keen more on the more immediate result, what you call here in previous from Ghana is real-time evaluations. That is more important in the planning system, because we use that feedbacks to the planning to revise the planning every year. And usually impact evaluation is taking too long. And by the time the result is there, and the program is going to different directions. One of the examples that we have in Indonesia is when we look at the impact of CCT, conditional cash transfers, it proved that CCT is effective in the context when the poverty is deep enough. But then Indonesia is gradually, the poverty is reduced, is declined, and the level of poverty is getting shallow. And then at the times that the evaluation is not really relevant because the condition is quite different. So it's already taking like 10 years, and then now suddenly the result is different, and the government's already taken to expand the program. And then I think the last word that is very important, and I got it from the Peru, is also from Indonesia. We never regard the qualitative evaluations. I think most of the evaluations that we have also in Indonesia, and we build already metadata for SDGs. We adopt almost all of the SDGs. For example, for health, out of 26 target in SDGs that has global indicators, we adopted in national development plans. But for the areas such as child protections and then abuse, woman abuse, we still use the statistical tool. So that's been quantitative, and we have difficulty in finding the data. And I think we never considered qualitative. How we can incorporate qualitative data into monitoring evaluation is important, and that's the one that I think we lack of. And I think we need to go directions in some of the data that is not really easy to collect, even if you have a very statistical advance. In such as Indonesia, we have very good statistical office, but most of them are, of course, basically on the survey, and it takes longer times, every 3, 4, 5 years. And then we're looking for the summary statistic, but actually the quality data is there, and we never use it. I think those are several key points that I can got from both the panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Pungas. I'll hand the floor over now to Dorothy. Dorothy is also, as I mentioned, the co-chair of EVAL SDGs, and this side event is done in partnership with Unicef, of course, and UNITAR and EVAL SDG, this network. So, Dorothy, you'll have the last word to sum up everything that's missing and more. And thank you very much for your ideas that you're going to put forth in your summary. And then, of course, you can have the concluding remarks as the third partner of this side event, EVAL SDG. Dorothy.
Thank you very much, Brooke. And it's not often I have the last word, so I'm really going to bask in this for a few moments. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to my co-discussant as well for bringing out the points. And also thanks to yourselves for bringing in what's obviously a very rich experience within the room. Interestingly, listening very carefully to the points that were put forward and some of the questions that were raised, I think we're all fairly familiar of the 5 Ps for the 2030 agenda. And what was coming up was 5 Ps for me for evaluation based on what you were all bringing forward. The first one that came out really clearly was policy, that without a strong policy environment, the power of evaluation has difficulty in gaining traction. So we've heard, I think, from every country that there has been work at the policy and strategy level where there's been leadership commitment to evaluation. The second one is participation, that we've heard a lot about a much more participatory approach through the 2030 agenda. And this is important for evaluation too. We've heard in the different countries where there's greater now partnership with private sector, with civil society. So that's really important too. And then there was a little bit of a tension between plans and priorities. The question in relation to, what plans are there available? There's a tension between, there are some very large national plans. The 2030 agenda itself stimulates plans, but it's a really big agenda. So how do plans move forward? They look at priorities. So we've heard very clearly from a number of countries to say, well, look, we have to prioritize. So let's focus on health, let's focus on education. Let's move forward, not just on plans, but our priorities within those plans. We've also heard a lot about processes. So embedding evaluation into ongoing processes, not reinventing the wheel, but looking at how systems are working, how systems can work better, not just the monitoring systems, but then gathering the data that comes through those systems into a more evaluative process that says what's working, what's not working, and how does that happen. And then the fifth one, of course, is principles, that the 2030 agenda itself has the principles of inclusion, of universality, but also in evaluation sector, we also have principles, and that's what brings in the credibility, the strength in the methodology. So those 5 really sort of stood out for me, and it's just weird that they were all Ps. Policy, participation, the plans, but with priorities, the processes, and the principles. But then overriding that comes back to the point about use. What's the point of all that if these evaluations are not used? So how do we do that? Where is the power? I think very clearly we've heard from our panelists there is power in evaluation, but is it reaching its potential? No, it's not. There is much more need to drive demand for evaluation. There's a need to drive deeper into the qualitative aspects. There's data available. How are we using that data? Are we synthesizing that data? Are we linking that data in a powerful way into decision makings that need to be made at that particular point in time? So therefore, if we are to move forward in terms of the power of evaluation, we have to be more dynamic. We have to look at some of those drivers and actually pick those up and move them forward. We know a lot more. Hearing the panelists, I sat in a similar panel several years ago, I think 2016, and we were still talking about, is evaluation relevant or is it not? I think we're past that. That demonstrates a level of power in evaluation. And hearing each country talk about what you're already doing, and doing so much already, and building that power. But are we driving the power fast enough for the 2030 agenda? That's certainly something that we have to consider as we move forward. So that's a little bit of a synopsis, and certainly I'm going to be taking something away from our panel today. And in that respect, I'll finish with a concluding vote of thanks as one of the key partners of organizing this event. We would certainly like to thank you all for participating, but a special thanks to our key partner, Unicef, who have partnered in putting this event together from a conceptual point of view, a supportive point of view, but also thank you very much for hosting and for feeding us. That's very much appreciated. To UNITAR, who are also our partners with Eval SDGs, and in looking at evaluation capacity development. And I'm actually going to hand back to Brooke in a minute to give you a quick information about an e-learning opportunity that you might be interested as well. Then we have many thanks to our panelists. Your distinguished presence here is not taken lightly. The fact that you've given of your time so generously is really very much appreciated. The fact that we've had such great representation from 5 completely different countries with different perspectives, and yet hearing your expertise is great. From Ghana, thank you very much for stepping in. Uganda, Cambodia, Chile, Indonesia, a very rich and deep information. And then, of course, the World Bank taking the world view and bringing your expertise. Thank you very much, Estelle. So thank you very much for coming, and back over to Brooke very quickly for a quick commercial.
A commercial break here at the end of the side event. Thank you very much, Dorothy. So as was mentioned by Dorothy, Eval SDGs in partnership with UNITAR will be running an e-learning course, a free open e-learning course, public registration. Anyone can register for it. On evaluation and the SDG, there are some flyers in the table, I believe, outside the door here. It's basically a course that's exploring the strategies, critical methods, and approaches and examples of M&E systems that mainstream the 2030 agenda in country systems. So it's a 2-week course. It's moderated, and we invite you to sign up or to spread the word, and perhaps you have colleagues back in your countries or in your organizations or what have you that would be interested in signing up for this particular course. And we'll take the liberty, I think there's a list of participants of the side event, and we'll take the liberty also to send, along with a follow-up email, I believe, the link where you can register online for this particular course. So if you're interested, please do sign up and or spread the word. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you. And just to let you know that this event has been recorded, and therefore all participants will receive a link to the recording, and that will also include some other information regarding the participants, the full bios. So we haven't had time to go through them, but thank you for providing those. And also other information about the partnership with Evaluate SDGs, UNITAR and UNICEF. So many thanks for coming today.